you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly second that comment. It is a welcome opportunity to speak in this place on this motion today, and I would like to commend the member for Brossard St. Labert for putting this motion forward. And I'd like to take a few moments today, Mr. Speaker, to explain exactly why I think that this is such an important motion. In particular, I'd like to focus on credit unions. Obviously, in our Conservative caucus, we have a wide variety of backgrounds. To my left, Mr. Speaker, we have a former president and chair of a large credit union. We obviously have farmers. We have business men and women who have conducted large amount of work and business with credit unions. And so I'd like to focus on that end of the cooperative sphere today, Mr. Speaker. And in my riding of Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola, and my former riding as well of Okanagan, Coquihalla, credit unions are often the financial cornerstone of these regions. For many of my constituents, it was a community credit union that said yes to their first mortgage, to their first small business loan, to that line of credit. And when some of the larger financial institutions that have international presence, Mr. Speaker, said, and you are, now I don't mean to suggest anything negative against Canada's larger financial institutions, who are part of the cornerstone of what many feel is one of the best banking systems in the world. But the fact is, to many of my constituents, they got their first start, their first financial start, so to speak, because a credit union said yes to them. Now, even as I wrote this speech on last Friday night, news had just spread that Valley First Credit Union, which is part of First West, donated $150,000 towards the South Okanagan Medical Foundation. Now, this is the same credit union that sponsors many local important community events. Now, in Summerland, there is a credit union that sponsors many other local events and is considered to be one of the best run of all of British Columbia. And it is all of one, Mr. Speaker, a single branch. But for the people in Summerland, it has been their financial and fiscal lifeline. It has helped finance the growth of Summerland since it was first founded in 1944. In fact, a remarkable story, back in 1944, the Summerland Credit Union was founded when 10 local citizens pooled together less than $20. And the rest, as they say, Mr. Speaker, is history. So why am I raising credit unions today and speaking in support of this motion? Well, the short, simple answer is because credit unions need our help. And they're not asking for a zero-interest loan like our friends at Bombardier. The reality is that credit unions are drowning. They're drowning in regulatory red tape and one-size-fits-all Ottawa-imposed regulation. For starters, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you would know that common reporting standards and FinTrack alone are creating massive compliance costs onto credit unions. One small credit union alone tells me they spend $100,000 a year in compliance costs. Now, to a large financial institution, $100,000 is probably a drop in the advertising bucket. But for a small community credit union, it means you are literally hiring people not to serve customers, but rather to serve Ottawa, filling out the required paperwork. And it is a massive burden, Mr. Speaker. And now the Liberal government comes along and says, oh wait, we're going to change mortgage regulations on you. Keep in mind, I'm not talking about the new stress tests. I'm talking about the punitive and unilateral decision to take away CMHC insurance on refinance mortgages. Now, Mr. Speaker, Canadians are a savvy bunch. We understand that accessing our home equity through a refinance mortgage is absolutely the most cost-effective way to invest in a small business, to finance home renovations, to consolidate debt, to survive a long labor lockout, to keep a family home after a divorce. Whatever the case may be, Mr. Speaker, refinancing a mortgage is a cost-effective way to invest in a local economy. And now with zero consultation, the Liberal government has taken that away. Now, what this means is small credit unions will have to allocate more funds to cover those mortgages, and in turn, it means that money is not available to flow into other sectors of the local community lending portfolio. and in turn means interest rates will need to be higher. All of this drives up costs on a credit union and ultimately, Mr. Speaker, its members. This is why credit unions are so greatly troubled by many of the measures that this government has put forward. In fact, on the mortgages, I go back, we have heard every single witness at the Finance Committee, including the witnesses put forward by the Liberals, all agreed these changes will have significant negative impacts on the industry and ultimately on Canadians. They also agreed there was zero consultation on why the Liberals are adamant on implementing these punitive changes. Now, we had bureaucrats at the Finance Committee, and while they could explain what or why the policy changes were, none of them could explain why this Liberal government wants to make these changes, Mr. Speaker. Now, I will even credit a few of my Liberal colleagues on the Finance Committee. When I put forward a motion to invite the Finance Minister so he could explain why he thinks these changes are good, they agreed with me and supported the motion. Now, for those of you less familiar with how the Finance Committee works, it's not every day that members of the government will agree to bring their own minister before the committee to explain himself. And so that brings me back to this motion. I could at length continue on the important roles that credit unions play in my riding, Mr. Speaker, and indeed I know many ridings throughout Canada, and that's why I'm pleased to support the motion. I can also state that since I've assumed the portfolio of Deputy Finance Critic, I've also heard at length from my credit unions on very serious struggles they are facing, all trying to keep up with Ottawa's imposed one-size-fits-all regulatory compliance-related red tape. And if we are to support this motion, and I'm hopeful, Mr. Speaker, that all parties and all members will be considered supportive of this motion, then by extension we must do more to recognize the value of cooperatives. We must ensure that we listen and that we make much-needed regulatory changes. These changes do not cost the taxpayer money, but they will help keep a more robust, a more diverse, and a more competitive fiscal sector in Canada, which is what we all believe needs to happen towards prosperity, Mr. Speaker. Now, before I close, I would like to briefly quote from the Desjardins Group, who made a presentation at the Finance Committee. And as Mr. Bernard Brun said it best, and I quote, "The rest of the country's financial cooperatives are an important and integral part of the Canadian financial system, and that the rules need to be adapted accordingly," end quote. I could not agree more, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I'm speaking in support of this motion today. And I do appreciate members' time to hear from my comments. And again, I'd like to thank the member who sponsored this motion, the member from Brossard St. Lambert, for putting this forward. I believe it is a helpful reminder, Mr. Speaker, that we must be thinking of our local communities, and we must be thinking of them when we're in this place, and not necessarily allowing the dictates of the politics of today to push us in a direction. Mr. Speaker, all good things in life are upstream, and I appreciate this member suggesting this is one way that we can make things better for cooperatives, including credit unions, right across this great country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.